Hi, and welcome to TechExcel's online training course on SpecDD. My name is Charles, and I'll be your instructor today. Today's lesson is going to be covering why SpecDD is requirement-driven and what exactly that means. Now, to provide a little background, we're actually going to be using a real live case that happened at TechExcel. This case involves sending email announcements. If some of you are DevSuite or ServiceWise, CustomerWise users, I'm sure you'll have received some TechExcel emails in the past announcing new product versions, upcoming webinars, or additional training materials. So when developing this sending email announcement, we had a requirement come up that needed to develop a status for the different email announcements that were going out. Something simple initially was written up. The requirement was supposed to have 3 different statuses: a to be sent status, an in progress status, and a sent status. Pretty standard, pretty common statuses for an activity, for an action. So the email announcements requirement was created, and it was estimated to require 2 days of effort. Again, something very simple, 3 statuses. As the developer started developing this seemingly simple requirement, on day 2, they actually already encountered an issue. When developing, and when it was first implemented, it was tested by the product owner, and it was found to be incorrect when opening up a different browser, a new browser, in the middle of one of the statuses. The specific example is that when the emails were in the process of being sent, whereas it should have been changed to an in progress status, it wasn't. Also, when it was supposed to be sent, it should have shown an in progress, and it should not have stayed in a to be sent status. Furthermore, it was discovered that there was an additional status that needed to be added, called preparing for data. As they kept on developing, they also found another issue on day 4. They wanted to add a new feature where if it was in progress, to not only simply state in progress, but to show the percentage as well. So right away you can see, with such a simple requirement, within a span of 4 days, not even a week, we've already gone through 2 sort of mini iterations, mini changes that needed to be done. These are important changes, but they're driven from the requirement, the original requirement. The original requirement is updated, changed, so that the developer can also change his or her work. Now, you see 2 different takes on this one simple requirement. You have the product owner and the customer, the original intent, simply wanted something to show up to say the status, to display the status of the email announcement. But then on the other side, on the programmer's side, you have to understand their reasoning, which is often based off of logical, empirical evidence. So in this particular case, the programmer had 3 different understandings. The first one being that the server side has to have the following states. Initially, to be sent, in progress, and completed. The second understanding was that if there was no status, then they thought that the display status was meant to be empty. And finally, the third understanding from the programmer side, after discussion, after in the middle of development, they realized that we needed to add a couple of statuses: sending, preparing for data, and potentially stopped. Now, when discussing this with the programmer, when you see it from their side, you realize that they're using programming logic to better understand, to better explain the user's requirements. They're also using their user experience to drive this working software. So they use the requirement, the original intent, to drive this working software. Now the third party enters into the scenario, and that's the QA testing group. Whether it's a single entity or a team, their logic and their reasoning is again going to be different than the original requirement writer as well as the developer. So now this QA tester had come in, and they're testing this, sending a new announcement with the sending, with the in progress and the finished. And they go through, and their logic and their reasoning is different. But it has to be based, their testing cases have to be based, need to be based, off of the original requirement. And that's where the requirement drives all three people, all three teams. So the QA actually created a couple of testing scenarios, and they had to look at it from different angles. So the new angle that the QA tester approached it from was actually time-based. They scheduled an email to be sent on a time in the future and in the past to make sure that this function worked correctly. If this time was set that is already passed, then the status change should be sending 0%, because the email announcements needed to be sent already. So ideally, they should all be in progress or finished. And in their third scenario, then they set it for an email to be sent in the future. Now, these should then have a scheduled status, which seemed to be a new status that needed to be added onto the existing ones. So instead of just sending and in progress and finished, QA discovered that they needed a scheduled state. How did you implement this? Well, in SpecDD, because of the requirement-driven methodology, the schedule state gets updated in the original requirement from the QA, from one of the last people to see this, gets updated, needs to be added in, and then goes through the entire cycle again with the developer, with the end-user product owners viewing the requirement, with the developer then developing based on that, and the QA testing it. So from here you can see how a QA tester drives from the requirement. So what can we learn from this real-life example? First off, it's very common and useful, I think, is to respect everyone's logic. Just because the requirement comes from originally the end user, the product owner, doesn't mean that it's always complete. There may be some angles that they didn't think of, or they didn't think were important, and the developer and the QA could be the ones to add on to that original requirement. SpecDD recommends, because of this, these interactions, that the user stories should be the communication standard. Now, communication, again, is extremely important. Not just in SpecDD, but I think for every company. And so in order to have a good communication network within your team, there needs to be a common standard, a place where everybody can input their ideas, can see other people's ideas, and make sure that everybody's logic and ideas and thoughts are viewed. And that's why SpecDD really recommends using these user stories as this standard. Thirdly, we want to make sure that these test cases are part of the requirements. Most specifically, these test cases are created from the requirements, based off of the requirements. These test cases should be improved based not only on these requirements, but also on the working software. And lastly, if the requirements need to be refined, they need to be modified, then these should be based on the working software as well. The design for a requirement does not have to be complete when the sprint iteration begins, because there are often times when the details cannot be known until the working software has been created or at least has begun development, in which you can further refine and further detail out those requirements based on that working software. So thanks for tuning in, and until next time, bye.